Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host today, Horst Feldhaeuser, Group Service Director at Infotools. Today we are joined by Jason Buchanan, Managing Director at the global market research agency Verve. Jason has a rich history in the insights sector, founding the Research Now APAC chapter and also steering SSI's APAC business to greener grasses. Jason has a passion for exploring how the world works, the know-how for making it better, a deep understanding of consumers, and even has a degree in neuroscience. Well, this is going to be an interesting talk today. So thanks for joining us on the show, Jason.
Oh, you're welcome, Horst. Thanks for the opportunity to join you.
Absolutely. Great to have you on board. So, Jason, what's the most significant thing you are going to tell us today?
So today we're talking about the world of online quantitative surveys. And I guess there's no real easy way to say this, but the businesses around the world who buy a sample would probably be shocked, and probably should be shocked, if they knew who was actually in their research sample data. So I'm not talking about the claims that suppliers make, about who's in the data with their panel books, but who are the actual people, the people who are completing the surveys, and how confident are the suppliers that those people answering are actually who they say they are.
Okay, wow, that's a big statement. And I'm actually intrigued and a little bit alarmed at the same time. What prompted you to have this position?
Yeah, so where do I start? I mean, as you can see in the background, for those who can see the background, I base myself in Ubud in Bali these days. So I work remotely, and because of this thing called COVID, I've sort of been stuck here for the last couple of years. Not a bad place to be stuck, admittedly, but stuck nonetheless. So last month, I had the opportunity to finally visit friends and family back in Perth in Australia, and did what anyone does when you go back to Australia, is you have a barbecue. And of course, at barbecues, there's nephews and nieces and friends of theirs. And being in research, I guess a bit curious. I was curious about what's cool in their world, these days. And they all seem to want to have an electric scooter. Now, I don't know how I know this. Maybe I asked them, but electric scooters cost about $1,000. They're not cheap. And after suggesting to them that, that's quite a few lawns you got to mow and a few cars you got to wash in order to get that much pocket money, they were sort of a little bit disappointed and horrified about the fact that they would have to rely on their parents for said pocket money, because in fact they had what they would soon describe to me as their money method. Now, Horst, we've been around the while. If someone was to say money method, there's a way of saving $1,000 in a relatively short time. Oh, exactly.
So give me one of those scooters. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure if I would buy a scooter with that money. But some nice New Zealand wine maybe might be the thing that I would go down the path of. But the thing that I started asking the obvious questions about what this is, and their answer was I guess why we're talking today. They said that they do online surveys. Yeah. Okay. You can imagine. I was a bit surprised, and these kids have no idea what I do for a living, right? They couldn't care what I do for a living. So there's no way I could have somehow influenced, or they're having a bit of a laugh or a joke, because last time I saw most of them, they're only 9. It's been a good 2.5, 3 years since I've seen them. So they do online surveys, and this naturally got me pretty curious, and so they were delighted to be able to show me how they went through and were doing this. And they were quite excited. They were getting out their phones and opening up their survey apps. And, I was a little bit curious about how, they're only 12. So how is this possible, given that 12-year-olds shouldn't really be even able to join panels and join services, under the age of 16, need the parental consent. No, they didn't have that, because they, of course, had figured out that they could use their parents' date of birth and join up to these things. And they were then able to take me through the concept of screening questions, like Jason, to make sure when you join up that when you get sent a survey, don't ever say that you're part of the industry, always answer none of the above, make sure that if the survey comes out, it says it's about cars, that you can kind of guess what the screening questions might be. Don't go too fast, because they might not give you your reward. All of these kind of things that a bunch of 12-year-olds had sort of figured out. This wasn't a story that I heard from someone else. This is happening right in front of me, in front of my very eyes. And I guess this issue of sample quality started to become, in my mind, perhaps it's a bit bigger than I first thought.
Wow, those 12-year-olds are clever, man. They figured it out
Right.
quickly, and all of our super clever questions that we want them to screen out, they completely just saw through it. So you've been obviously around for a little while. How do you think that the state of the sample quality has changed over the years? And has this, because we've discussed this 10, 15, 20 years ago, right, that it might be an issue?
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, my day is sort of back in Research Now and SSI, which is a little bit dinosaurish now. Those brands haven't been around for a while since they became Donata, but we were talking about this sort of stuff 10, 15 years ago. So what this experience did for me was focus attention on an issue which probably hasn't been properly addressed. I mean, when people talk about sample quality or panel quality, what seems to be the focus is in the fight against bots and click farms. So quality has become about identifying fraudulent behavior at the end of the survey, once people have already completed it. But in this situation, I'm curious about how did these people even get to become part of the invitation process in the first place. These are not sophisticated tech fraudsters who have, a click farm in some low-cost country, with 400 mobile phones on a wall. These are kids who responded to probably an online ad out there saying, make money by doing surveys, to which they responded. And then since then figured out, because the promise that they originally responded to, and this is something I was quite curious about, is that they responded to the promise of making money by doing surveys. And for someone who needs to save up to get an electric scooter, making money is the key question there. So the advertising found them, online, and then they just started doing whatever they needed to do. So the issue that it highlighted for me is the verification of who's doing these surveys in the first place. Most, I guess over the last couple of months particularly, I've been spending a lot of time talking to people, and upon asking about this issue of sample quality, people are saying to me, this is their figures, this is not me, my own personal experience, saying that they can throw away 30, 40, 50, up to 60%, someone's mentioned to me, of the sample that they get in. And some of the suppliers that they're using, they're not necessarily small names in the industry. But their issue has been we'll just replace that for free. Sorry about that. And so to answer your original question about the state of sample quality, we seem to be, I don't know if I want to call it perpetual decline. I mean, I don't want to sort of say that everything is necessarily bad, but I am curious about how the role of, moving more towards scalable automation, less personal. These issues didn't seem to be an issue back in the day when our hair was less grey, Horst, when it comes to field work with face-to-face and even caddy to a certain extent. Fraud wasn't really an issue because it was, if someone said that they were a 12-year-old, or sorry, they were a 32-year-old, but they're actually 12, it was going to be pretty obvious that wasn't the case. But here, it's not necessarily doing that. So that at scale is a bit of a consideration. And then also the fact that everything is self-completed. I took up their opportunity to join a few survey companies because I was curious about what had changed, over this last little while. And I could add in whatever date of birth I really wanted to, and there was no verification. I know that's very, very difficult to do, but if we open the door to gamification and these people trying to, game the system, then we probably need to be a little bit more clever in making sure that people are who they say they are, I think.
Yeah, and what you mentioned before, right? When we say, well, we might throw away 30, 40, 50%, that's the obvious stuff that we see through speeding and survey bots, whatever. But it doesn't even take into account a 12-year-old who tells us he's a 35-year-old woman working in Perth and is a mother that works from home. So how do you? Surely we all think, oh no, this is not going to happen. So how do you think how widespread that is? Is that just a random sample of one, you? Or...
yeah. Well, did I happen to be at the only barbecue in the whole world?
Exactly.
That bunch of, and I guess I don't have any evidence to suggest that all 12-year-olds are on all panels. That's certainly not the case. And this is the point that you're raising now is really where part of the crux of the problem starts becoming even more problematic. So it's really, really difficult to know how widespread the problem is, I think, because unless a supplier is totally committed to the cause of addressing this type of issue, it can go unseen. And then if you've got a bunch of people who are motivated to do what they need to do in order to get the reward, it can become problematic. And knowing a little bit about technology, it's actually quite easy sometimes to accidentally screen out legitimate people. It's plausible these days for people to be using a VPN and you can detect that, but they're actually genuinely answering the surveys. So the post recognition of what's happening is, I'm not sure how much better that situation can happen. There's a lot of really good technology solutions that are out there that have been around and being in development and being utilized for 20 years. So this shouldn't have been able to happen, but it has. And so what that means then is that, and during that time, I should say that I only saw one person get knocked back. I got a daily report from all these people because I asked them, how much money did you make today? And
Wow.
how many surveys you did today? And only one out of, and I don't know I should dig out the figures. I should have done that beforehand, but there's only one person who got back and going, they didn't know they didn't use the word screen out because that's my term, but I just wasn't let into a survey. And someone else who said, they didn't give us a survey because I was too tired. That's because I had to go to bed because I've got to get up in the morning, and it was like 10:30 at night for these kids is pretty late doing surveys and stuff. But them bashing out their $10 a day kind of quota wasn't too difficult for them. So how widespread is it? I'm not quite sure. But the issue is that if it can happen once, was I the only person who ever came across this? I don't know. I'd have to believe maybe not.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We should probably give those 12-year-olds real jobs working for panel companies. Maybe they could help us. That might be an idea.
I'm secretly enlisted them. They don't even know they're part of my
they're already working
project.
for you. So just flipping it a little bit, I mean, one of the big things that we as an industry often struggle in, and we talked about this quite a bit as well on our blogs and other articles and stuff like that, is measuring the impact or the return of investment in market research and insights. And one could argue, if we're getting the insights or the outcomes that we kind of expect to get, do we actually care if someone gives us has a bad actor or a bad respondent in there? As long as it's kind of within the margin, I'm all right. I can show my boss that I'm getting the right results. Do I care? Should I?
Yeah. So yeah. So that is a really, really somewhat brilliant question, actually, because it's a really hard one to answer. Do buyers or do people care? I'd largely think that there's a care factor there. But if you asked me 10 years, let's start here. If you asked me 10 years ago, would by 2022 this problem have been addressed and sorted, I would have said absolutely yes. It would have to have been, because my guess would have been also that prices would have gone back up, because 10 years ago prices for sample were pretty low. When I first started this game, in London, we were able to charge £10 a complete for a relative, not very long survey, and the Panama was getting £3. Now, back in then, when to the Australian dollar or New Zealand dollar was almost 3 to 1, that's a very, very different price point to the one we're looking at now. So, and even 10 years ago. So I would have thought that prices would have had to have gone back up again because of the technology and the types of things that would have had to have been put in place to be able to change things. But that hasn't really happened. And I have had people comment on the fact that, if they're a buyer, particularly if they're a research company, if they're a research agency, they can sometimes lose projects on the price of the sample. And, if we're talking about the difference, and sample companies saying that they sometimes lose jobs or projects on 30 cents a complete, so there's a price sensitivity there, which is kind of hard baked into the system, so do they care? The way I like to think about it is, I saw an article a couple months ago about saying that there's two types of people in the world: those who break the world into two types of people and those who don't. And I promised myself that I would never become one of those people. But I think I'm going to break my promise right now, because what I think I'm seeing are two themes emerge. There's There's those who sort of are happy to go along and not really ask the questions because, it's almost like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I'm not convinced it's broke just yet or broken just yet. So I think there's certainly a proportion of people who would subscribe to that theory. And then I also think that there's a growing number based on my own personal details, so I'm a sample size of one, going and asking people about these kinds of topics. And there seems to be a growing or emerging group of, people who are starting to think, what, this is a bit of a problem. If we are measuring the impact of insights, then are we going to be able to do that? And my job, I would certainly never be one to judge where someone lands on either side of that fence. But I would encourage people to make a conscious decision about that. Do they actually care, or do they actually not really care because there's not a problem? And to sort of force themselves to make that choice, because then I think what just ends up happening is that those who do will have that conversation, will have the conversation with suppliers, and the forces of supply and demand will juggle accordingly, and those who don't will make some other choices, and that will tend to sort itself out. And that's where I think, I don't know, I feel like I will ask you the same question, Horst, about what you're seeing, because it's an issue which I just feel like there is a bit of momentum, and it was all hearsay or talk 10 years ago, but I'm thinking that it's starting to become a little bit more talked about, and the realization that there's something we probably really should do as an industry to fix this.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think, I'm a great supporter of, there is a big responsibility on the buyer side, right? They need to care. And, we can't, yes, we're in the age of technology and the age of AI and all that kind of stuff. But as you said before, it's not about technology. It's about human beings, playing the system for, some of them even just for a small gain. But obviously for us as a research buyer or supplier, that could have a massive impact. And I think, yes, you have to pay for the quality and for that extra step. Maybe what I was really interested in is, what would these fraudulent respondents would look like if we collate their answers? And listen to me just for a little bit, because I think it might be quite amusing. They could almost be like, let's call them Fabricated Frank, and they had the perfect CV, earning 3 times the average salary, while they're a university student living at home, and is single with no dependents, or has a wife and 2 children, allergic to pets, has 3 cats and a dog. I could go on, has a long-term partner, but also lives in the suburbs or in a city apartment. We could go on and on and on. And it's, I think, that what are those challenges? Because those answers that these people give us, they're just made up, right? They're just
Fabricated Frank, is that who? Yeah, that's
Fabricated Frank. I like.
That's my new avatar, I think, when I'm looking at this problem now. Fabricated Frank is my new avatar. So thanks, Horst. Yeah. What I think we're really talking about here is I don't know, the way I frame it in my mind is sort of hope this makes sense, the garbage in, garbage out problem. So I think, and this is just, again, based on conversations I've had with people, is that there's been a confidence, or somewhat of a confidence, that we can smooth out these errors because there's, it is a problem, but we can smooth them out through some kind of analytical process or some kind of cleaning process at the end of the survey. But the reality in my mind is, and I'm not the world's best analyst for sure, I can barely even spell it, to be honest with you, but I know a lot of people who are really good in this kind of area. And, the idea that you can have somewhat, poor data in and magically sprinkle some dust to make it really great data out is a little bit of an illusion, a little bit of a pipe dream. And so the idea of addressing fraudulent Frank, like how does fraudulent Frank actually even end up participating in the first place? How was someone like that encouraged to actually behave in that particular way for whatever that might be? And the answers to those questions, I think, are really illuminating. Because at the end of the day, when you start cleaning information or cleaning data at the end of a project, it messes with almost everything. It messes with the quotas. It messes with all sorts of other decisions that have been locked out, or other people have locked out of surveys that they probably would have answered, because their experience isn't there. And so that almost comes back to a point that I think I made a little bit earlier about the fact that unless a supplier is focused on that avatar, if they're saying, you know what, we are not going to allow fraudulent Frank to even come in the first place, we're going to make sure that that's not there. And that is a big task. That is a big undertaking. That is not a simple task in any way, shape, or form. But if the role is to provide completed surveys, then the fraudulent Franks are going to end up in there because, you know, he or she is a data point. But if the focus is on, well, how do we make sure that they don't even come in? And what are we doing? What does the entire business model look like to ensure that we're dealing with known people who are more likely, that we know are that give us a much better than average chance of making sure that, you know, that university student who's living at home but actually has 3 times the salary and has 3 BMWs parked in the garage somehow, isn't just ticking all the boxes that they need to be.
So as a real person, and I like your analogy with garbage in, garbage out. It's not about cleaning the garbage in at the end, right? It's we need to make sure that we don't even get the garbage in. And this will come back to what you said before, panel quality and price probably, right? Because we need to ensure that these people are real, they're authentic. What else can we do to lift, once we have them, say, okay, we have a panel and we believe that at least the majority, if not all of our people as part of that panel are real people, so they're not made up people. What else can we do to make the process better for them, so we keep them? Because obviously the next thing is, right, we've got a good panel. What we don't want is losing them because we have shitty surveys and stuff like that.
So we're now touching on the other issue, which is joined at the hip. They're actually not two issues. They're part of the same problem, but also, you know, you can't have a problem without an opportunity, right? So part of the same opportunity, and that is that, and it's an underestimated factor, I think, for sure, and one that we should all be talking about in this industry, and that is the experience we're asking people to participate in. You know, so an illuminating question to ask, and you can go and do this, of course, when you're talking to all the people that you're talking to, about whether, as a researcher, the person you're talking to would be happy to answer their own survey 3 times on a mobile phone. Right. So the big grid question and the stuff that is, I don't know, methodologically sound, but in today's day and age where experience seems to be everything. I mean, the experience economy, people are talking about all this kind of stuff, employee experience, customer experience, you know, everything experience. There's companies who have built a very strong reputation and sold businesses based on the fact that they participate in the experience economy, you know, so it must be important. Yet for some reason, it's not something that we tend to talk about. I mean, even I used an example, I think, in an article that I wrote recently about, imagine you go to a restaurant, you're invited to the restaurant, and you turned up only to be told that, sorry, we've got enough of you in the restaurant right now, come back another time, or that all the criteria, you don't meet any of the criteria, sorry, for coming into the restaurant, even though you weren't told about that beforehand. Now, it sounds a bit weird, right? But that is what the average research participant is experiencing. If they're trying to participate. And so this is a hard problem because quotas and screening questions are important. Methodologically, they're almost required to a certain extent. But if you think about the experience that then creates, who are the people who are left who are willing to put up with that kind of thing is a real challenge. You know, what if they get through the screening questions then, or the quota questions? What then happens if they're presented with a whole bunch of grids or quite a long survey? The temptation, of course, is because of the issue of declining response rates and participation rates, particularly in online quant. The issue becomes, well, even if they did qualify, you know, congratulations, you have qualified for our survey, is kind of the mindset, or the
here's another half hour of questions. Thanks very much.
And so that becomes problematic in a number of senses, because who makes that decision? Like, from what I've seen, there's almost no conscience. You've got this bunch of people called suppliers who want to sell as many completes as possible, and you've got these people who are buyers who want to buy as many completes as possible for the best possible price. And who is the conscience that sits in between those two that says, hang on, just because you can doesn't mean you should on this occasion. Just because you can ask 50 questions that are all relatively same. And I get the fact that some research, scripting software looks pretty good these days, but that doesn't necessarily make for a great experience. And the idea of people actually testing their own surveys and doing them, and would I participate in this thing myself, is ironically a question that not many people, when I ask them, really consider. And when they do, oh yeah, we're actually putting people through something which is actually not particularly good, but we need the data. The clients want the data,
and we give them $3.50, so they can't
$3.50.
complain.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's a very long survey. If they're getting a whole $3.50 on some patients. So they know that. So those two themes, and a lot of the focus has been, sometimes the panel companies and the suppliers get an absolute pasting because of the types of people that they're presenting up for surveys. But the whole issue of what have these people been put through time and time and time again is something which I don't think gets as much attention, but is absolutely pivotal in the bigger picture about who is participating. So that's one place to start, and then also to work with suppliers who take this stuff really seriously, like not just, you and I could probably start a business and answer every single quality question spot on, right? I know I could, but is it actually happening behind the scenes? And so working with suppliers or those who really do take this sort of stuff seriously is something that I would also encourage people to do.
Yeah, that's great. And does SX exist? Survey experience? We should make that up, because it does. Customer experience exists, right? And human experience.
Well,
SX, let's do it. Survey
let's
experience.
Do it.
You heard it first here on this blog, man.
If this turns up as a thing next week and I haven't been involved, we're going to have a conversation.
and I think you're absolutely right, because if we get the recruitment correct at the beginning when we sign them up to those panels, and certainly I think some of the consumer panels, not the field provider panels, that they're a little bit more of that, is do we need to ask them all those screening questions, because we should know a lot of those things already. So it is definitely about the experience, the SX. We just made that up. Love it. So what are some of the other ways that someone in an insights team, whether that's on the client side or on the provider side, they can take a little bit of control back on that? What do you think?
I mean, this is not an easy problem necessarily to solve. I mean, as you can imagine, a big part of my current job is actually looking at this. So I get to live and breathe this kind of stuff every single day. And a lot of what we're finding is the issue of where, what types of surveys, where is it appropriate? Are we, just because we can do a quant study, is it the most appropriate thing? Is there a better way that we can look at this? We're starting to look at, let's take the average, what people would describe as a hard to reach person, or B2B, for example. B2B is classic. Let's sort of use that as the frame. A lot of B2B panels are actually consumer panels that have just had the people ask the questions, what do you do for a job and what are you responsible for? And the verification of any of that information is almost zero. That's not to say that all B2B is doing a bad job, but it's a really interesting example of where it's even more important to understand that people are who they say they are, but is that kind of happening? So the strategies that we're sort of that we're looking at are, again, how do we start with working and collaborating with people who we call respondents in ways that don't necessarily look like research. We're doing quite a bit of work at the moment in the area of leading edge consumers. Now, these leading edge consumers would never in a million years join a research panel, but they are willing to participate in activities and research activities and insights activities if treated correctly and appropriately. So I found that really interesting. That was one of our experiments that we've been creating or sort of looking at earlier this year. It's not about the participation necessarily. And so, what strategies or tactics can people look at? That's something that I think is worth experimenting with. Just because we can use a panel, for example, is that the appropriate way of going about doing it? Just because we can do a long online survey, is that what we should be doing in this particular instance? The idea of that somewhere along the line, respondents became inhuman. They became a different species of thing, that are there to respond. They're actually called respondents. Your job is to respond to anything I send you. Whereas they're probably humans first, that then choose to respond or not to things based on existing experiences, just like any other consumer would. And so that fundamental mindset of going into a research project and just thinking about what experience am I actually offering up in the first place to these people that we really need to participate in order to get the job done, is the starting point of a lot of great research projects. And what comes from that might be changes and experiments in methodology, or changes and experiments in the way that people are, we call them collectives and collaborations rather than panels or communities these days, because that's really what we're doing. We're collaborating with people who would otherwise be called participants or respondents, but they're collaborators on our project. And by just looking at that, it's not a bad starting point.
Yeah, no, and I think you're absolutely right. They're humans first, right? And participants, is better than respondents 100%. But yeah, respondents definitely is a term I think we don't really want to use.
A lot of people still refer to these people as sample, as data, as completes, right?
Data points even.
And that's my opinion is that's where it all starts going south.
And I think, look, I think there's a lot of companies out there that they're doing a really good job in supporting that.
Absolutely.
And also pushing the I think the responsibility back to their buyers, whether it's an agency or whether it's an end client. I think there's I've certainly seen some amazing end clients as well, where they said, well, let's not do a market research project because it costs us $30,000 to find out whether people would like this specific FMCG product, but if we just build it and test it in an obscure market, it costs us half the money. And if it works, then we have it already. And if it doesn't work, nothing gained, nothing lost, right? So I think it becomes the responsibility. And you said this, look, we need to look after the human part of those and the humans that take part in this, people, and also then the experience and making sure, do we really need to do and ask those questions? That's really cool.
I think it's a good summary because what is methodologically sound isn't necessarily a great experience. That's part of the key, isn't it? Just because we learned Research 101 as doing something in a particular way, in this day and age, the reality is that the competing forces of digital experiences, which is really where a lot of research has gone down the path of, they've become very digital experiences, means that we are competing in that space. And the moment we forget about that, I think it becomes a little bit challenging post that.
Yeah, let's pivot a little bit. And I mentioned in the intro that you also have a passion for thinking how the world works and the human body works and all that kind of stuff. Now you're also a director at the Juicy Effect, a boutique wellbeing and healing sanctuary in Bali. Tell me a bit more about that, because that sounds amazing.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this conversation's about to turn left, Horst.
We're completely pivoting away from market research. Why not?
We are pivoting. Yeah, why not? Well, there is a research theme here. I mean, so my better half, Sharon, is actually an ex-researcher. She's ex-client side, ex-agency side. So the Juicy Effect sort of started because of this problem that Sharon had. She had some digestion problems that she's going to doctors. No one could kind of sort those problems out. So she just, as a typical ex-researcher would, she just started going to the problem, going, right, well, how do I fix this, and who can I talk to, and almost viewed herself as her own research project, and started studying Ayurvedic medicine. And what she found is that not only was she able to then address her own issues, but people would start asking her some questions. And so fast forward, what is it, maybe 15 years now. There's a business in Ubud, and if you've ever been to Ubud, Ubud is the centerpiece of all things strange and therapeutic, and in the well-being world. And so the business became something focusing on alternative therapies, I guess you would call it, just but more about the balancing of mental, emotional, spiritual health, even, which is something which is not often spoken about, and giving priority to what people would largely call energy rather than treating physical symptoms. So Ayurveda, kinesiology, hypnotherapy, energy healing, things like that. And the really interesting thing about this is that, I mean, I work full time in Verve, but I'm obviously closely associated with the business and have my own little things that I do. And what I found interesting is that these approaches, when they take a whole of person mindset to the problem, they can actually address the real root cause. And I guess that's one of the things that stuck with me about that as a concept. If you're looking at treating the whole of the person or the whole of the issue, as a starting point, it actually changes the game somewhat.
Now, would you say that, having been involved in this for the last 15 years or so, had an impact on, how you think, what you do, how you strategize as a market researcher and an insights person, which is kind of outside the, industry that we're talking about, but, has it had an impact on
Absolutely,
your professionalism? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I use the principles of some of the techniques that I just mentioned to you all of the time. I just don't use those terms because I would be considered to be a little bit crazy. And hey, we're going to look at this from Ayurvedic medicine talks about doshas. So they've got the balance of these different energetic forces. And if you're talking about that in a company, you'd be laughed out of a boardroom. But the principles behind it, I use all of the time. So the perspective that it's given me is one that I probably just touched on before about the whole of business. I would consider myself a science guy originally. If you asked me 10 or 15 years ago, if you couldn't see it, it didn't exist. Energy was something that came in the form of a power socket or Red Bull, if you bash through a couple of them. So through these experiences and the sort of stuff that Sharon was taking on board, I started to look into it and do my own research about some things and realize that I was probably a little bit naive, a little bit ignorant of certain topics and certain things. So I found that, for my own, learning quite interesting. But so where has that gone to, and where is the link back to research? It's an interesting question because there is for me personally, there is a very specific link, and that is that if you take the science-based research paradigm that you can, in order to understand something, you can break it down into its parts and analyze and study those parts, and then extrapolate back out to the whole. Whereas if you look at a more sort of non-traditional, non-classic scientific approach, some could argue, and I don't necessarily agree with this, but it's almost like a quantum approach. What I found interesting is that in the Vedic texts of 5,000 years ago, quantum theory was as prevalent as anything. So in other words, they were talking about the fact that everything is already connected in mysterious ways. This idea that the universe is connected in all sorts of ways that we can't necessarily explain, non-locality, non-linearity, all these kinds of concepts, which I used to think was all rubbish, right? But with my own eyes, and guess through my own experiences, I've sort of seen that, well, the classic science approach, and you could argue that research is a kind of a classic type of science in the sense that we do try to break things down in a way. And I guess the difference between what I'm talking about, well, let me share a bit of a story, actually. I use a story all the time and hopefully it comes across okay, because have you ever heard the story of the 6 blind men and the elephant?
Maybe, but tell me again.
Okay, yeah. So the reason I use this all the time is because it's quite a nice way of doing it. So back in the day, as the story goes, 5,000 years ago, there was a leader of a village who heard that an elephant was coming to the village and dispatched 6 blind men to go and figure out what this thing called an elephant was all about. Now, why you would dispatch, pardon me, why you would dispatch 6 blind men to do this, I don't know, but the story doesn't work unless they're blind, right? So I think that's the reason why. So the 6 blind men went down to where the elephant would be, and the first one goes up to the elephant, of course, but being blind, they've got their other senses, and so I'm going to start touching the elephant. And the first one walks up to the leg and says, an elephant is just like a tree trunk. The second one grabs its tail, thinks it's more like a piece of rope. The third one grabs its tusk, thinks it's a spear. The fourth one grabs its ear, thinks it's a fan, and so forth. So the moral to the story, I believe, because I wasn't there back then, Horst, I'm not that old, right? But is that you can take a piece of the puzzle and make a very, very incorrect judgment about what we think is the frame of reference that we're talking about. Could you imagine how the world of surfboards would have been changed if we started mistaking elephants for pieces of rope?
Would be interesting to drag that elephant along to the beach.
Could you imagine a guy who was like really interested in being a world champion javelin thrower and wanted to start, throwing spears as a kid, started trying to pick up elephants just to throw them? It becomes a really big problem. So this idea that I mentioned before about, getting to the heart of the problem by not necessarily breaking it down into its component parts and just studying those, but not losing sight of the big picture and the bigger frame, is something which has stuck with me. And so the projects that I'm involved with and the things that we're looking at doing, it's just a nice reminder that the minute that I forget about that, we can go and we can start analyzing everything, and we can analyze pieces of the puzzle to our heart's content. But if we actually think that an elephant is a piece of rope and we will not hear anything differently, then we are in all sorts of trouble. And so I guess that kind of stuff, that whole of, what is the entire frame? What if we couldn't break the pieces down into its component parts and analyze it and truly understand it? What would that mean for a project? What would that mean to the problem that we're trying to solve? What would that mean to the categorization of the actual problem? And those sort of things have helped me in my professional career absolutely significantly, but also in personal life as well.
And it's a fantastic example with the elephant, I think. And it's so timely as well, because more and more we have those discussions like, okay, you can't just look at your sales data or your market research data or your media data in isolation. You have to bring them together because they all work together. They're all pieces of the elephant, right? Yeah. So we can't just be the tree trunk. No, we need to work with the ears and the tail and stuff like that. I love that. I think we're almost at the end of our little chat. Just before we wrap up, is there any other activities that you would recommend others to look into in order to become a better market researcher, or do things differently?
Good question. I personally, I'm a fan of going beyond your own ignorances, and what I mean by that, that's me talking to myself. That's not to say that everyone else is ignorant about some things. It's about things that I used to think were absolutely true, I've managed to convince myself probably aren't, and so those sort of things you go through. And so, I think the question was about, how did someone become better market researchers? What are other activities or things? It's almost investigating your own things. I'm going to share something which I actually have never shared with anyone really before. And one of the things that I did, I'd heard about meditation, right, and heard about yoga philosophy, and I was curious about, because yoga actually means, everyone thinks it's all about lycra and downward dogs and mats, right? But actually the original definition, according to the yoga scriptures, I've gone and studied all this kind of stuff, so I've become a little bit of a mini expert on it all, is to help control the natural fluctuating tendencies of the mind. So it's got nothing to do with the physical, it's got everything to do with being able to rebalance the mind to bring it back to an equilibrium, which I found fascinating. In the 196 Yoga Sutras, there's only 2 that actually describe the physical practice, if you can believe that. So somehow it's become, something that's sort of not. Now, why am I telling you that? Why am I finding that? I found that interesting because not only did it give me that kind of thing, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that everyone should go down and study that kind of stuff, but I started questioning my own sort of thought processes. I started questioning things like, in my previous role, I've been very interested in personalities and character and things like that. And I used to use a lot of assessments, Myers-Briggs and all that kind of stuff. But when you really scratch the surface, you find out that, hang on a second, the science behind some of these things is a little bit iffy. Is it any more iffy than using astrology to judge someone's character? When you start tracing it back, you don't really know, And so I've gone and studied a whole bunch of really, really strange things not to necessarily suggest that they are the answers to certain things, but just to kind of open the mind about what and how the world comes together. And so that would be my encouraging thing to all researchers: to overcome the elephant problem is to be able to challenge our own biases and our own ignorances and our own thought process and our own paradigms and our own mindsets, and just see what happens. Would probably be the way that I'd answer that question.
That's fantastic. Well, that was fascinating. Just quickly want to recap what we talked about today is, we talked about how your 12-year-olds from next door complete market research surveys to buy electric scooters, and probably some other things that is likely more widespread than we think, or maybe that we accept it to be. That this whole technology, automation, automatic fraudster detection and checks are probably not good enough, because we need to address it at the front end. There's a significant need for panel and field suppliers to truly verify the identity of the people that we're letting in, and then we obviously want to talk to them, and that they're of course humans. And then we need to really care about this and not just pretend that we do, and that sample quality has its price. And I think one of the things that you said at the end, and that definitely resonates a lot with me as well, is of course that having something that you're passionate about outside your professional career, and maybe even outside your comfort zone, right? Whether it's a side hustle or a hobby or something that truly challenges you, often makes you a better professional as well. I think that covers it all. Jason, anything else from you before we wrap up?
No, I think that's an amazing summary. You've got amazing memory, Horst. We covered a lot of ground today. But I guess the other thing is just to say good on you for having this podcast. I mean, challenging views is a wonderful catalyst for the change. And I think you made the point, but just to make sure that I had made this very, very clearly, this is not about bashing suppliers or bashing existing techniques or saying that one is better than the other or anything like that. It's more about, if we don't really, ask these questions and as an industry start looking at this kind of stuff, maybe we're comfortable with the solutions, then nothing really changes, And so I guess based on that summary, again, congratulations for looking into topics that are significant, because I think it's really important.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. That's a wrap for Now That's Significant.